He never married. He died a virgin. He once threatened to burn his mother alive. And yet the world gave him a state funeral fit for a king, with dukes and earls carrying his coffin, and a nation weeping at the feet of a man who, by most accounts, was nearly impossible to love. Who was he? What did he do that made the world stop and bow its head? If stories like these bring you comfort, please subscribe. Also, leave a comment telling us whose life you'd like to hear next. We read everyone. Tonight, we travel to a cold stone house in Lincolnshire, England. The year is 1642. A civil war is tearing the country apart. Galileo has just drawn his final breath across the sea in Italy. And here, in this quiet house at the edge of a frozen field, a woman named Hannah gives birth to a boy so small and so fragile that no one believes he will survive the night. He has no father. He will soon have no mother either, not in any way that counts. He will grow up largely alone in the care of a grandmother, in a house full of his own drawings and questions and half-built machines. This is the bedtime biography of Isaac Newton. Chapter 1. The Boy Born on Christmas Day. The manor house at Woolsthorpe sits on a gentle rise above the flat Lincolnshire fields, built from local limestone, the color of old cream. In the winter, it catches the gray light and holds it. The rooms are low-ceilinged and stone-floored, and the cold comes up through the floor and in through the gaps around the windows, and the fireplaces work hard against it. It is into this house, on this particular cold morning, that Isaac Newton arrives. He arrives early and small and without his father, who has been in the churchyard at St. John the Baptist in Colsterworth since October. 3 months gone. A farmer who worked this land, owned it, could not write his own name, and left it all behind without ever knowing that his wife was carrying a child. The child who would carry his name into a future he could not have imagined. Hannah Aisco Newton is 23 years old. She has been a widow since the autumn. And now, on Christmas morning, she holds a baby so slight, so underprepared for the world, that the women gathered in the room exchange quiet glances. They have seen this before, the two small ones, the ones who come too soon. They do not always stay. But this one stays. He is baptized on the first day of January, at the church where his father is buried, and given the name Isaac, the same name. As if the family is trying again, sending the same soul back into a world that took the first one too quickly. The house he is born into is not a poor house. The Newton family has farmed this land for generations, and Hannah's son will inherit it one day. The fields, the sheep, the stone walls, the orchard. His grandfather Robert Newton purchased the manor back in 1623, and it passed to his father, and now, in some legal and patient sense, it belongs to this infant who cannot yet lift his own head. But inheritance is a quiet thing. It waits. What does not wait is the boy's curiosity. From his earliest years, those who knew him would remember a child who watched things, the way shadows moved, the way water ran, the way a wheel turned. The walls and ceilings of his childhood room were covered in drawings made in charcoal, birds, ships, men, mathematical figures, circles, and triangles. A whole silent world sketched onto the plaster, the inner life of a boy who had not yet learned to speak it in any other language. The countryside around Woolsthorpe is wide and flat and very quiet. There are elm trees along the lanes. There are sheep on the hillsides. There is a sky that in summer goes on forever, and in winter presses down low and gray over the frozen fields. It is the kind of landscape that teaches a child to look upward, and to wonder what lies past the clouds, past the cold, past the very edge of what can be seen. The year 1642 is a year of endings and beginnings, as all years are, but more so than most. England is at war with itself. And far away in Italy, in a villa outside Florence, an old astronomer named Galileo Galilei has just died. The man who first turned a telescope toward the heavens and read what he found there. A torch passing from one set of hands to another, though no one in this cold Lincolnshire room could possibly know it yet. Tonight, Isaac Newton is only a few hours old. The fire is low. His mother holds him close. Outside, the fields are still and pale, and the world is waiting, quietly, patiently, though it does not yet know what it is waiting for. Chapter 2. Left Behind. There is a particular kind of loneliness that belongs to childhood, the kind that arrives not with noise or drama, but with a quiet closing of a door, a cart disappearing down a lane, a figure growing smaller in the distance until it is gone entirely, and the world contracts to just the house, just the fields, just the sound of the wind moving through the elm trees. Isaac Newton is 3 years old when his mother leaves. She does not go far. The Reverend Barnabas Smith, the minister of the church at North Witham, is a wealthy and respectable widower. He wants Hannah Newton for his wife. And the terms of the arrangement are practical, as such things often were in the England of that time. Hannah will go to live in North Witham, 1.5 miles down the road. Isaac will stay behind at Woolsthorpe, in the care of his maternal grandmother, Marjorie Issac, 1.5 miles. Close enough to see on a clear day, if you knew where to look. Far enough to be another world entirely. Marjorie Issac is not an unkind woman. She keeps the house, tends the fire, sees that the boy is fed and clothed. But she is not his mother. And the thing that Isaac needs, the particular warmth of being chosen, of being kept close, is the one thing she cannot give him. So he turns inward. It is what children do when the outer world offers too little. He fills the silence with his own making. The walls of his room at Woolsthorpe slowly fill with charcoal drawings, birds in flight, human figures, ships under sail, windmills, mathematical shapes, circles within circles. His friend and later biographer, William Stukeley, would write that the walls and ceilings were covered with drawings he had made with charcoal. A whole interior world, pressed into the plaster of a Lincolnshire farmhouse by a boy who had learned early that the most reliable company was his own imagination. He watches the way light falls through the window at different hours. He watches the shadow of the sundial in the yard move its slow arc through the day. He builds small things with his hands, models, mechanisms, contrivances whose workings he understands completely because he invented them himself. The world outside may be uncertain, may withdraw without warning, may leave without explanation, but the world he builds with his own hands does exactly what he intends. Perhaps this is where it begins. Not in Cambridge, not in the orchard with the apple, but here, in these quiet years, in a cold stone house, where a small boy learned that understanding how things work was the closest thing to controlling whether they stayed. Down the road, his mother is building a new family. She and Barnabas Smith will have 3 children together, a daughter Mary, a son Benjamin, a daughter Hannah. Half-brothers and half-sisters that Isaac barely knows. His grandfather James Issac, who lives nearby, leaves nothing to Isaac when he makes his will, a small but telling detail suggesting little warmth passed between them. The world around the boy is full of people who are present without quite being there. When Isaac is 10, Barnabas Smith dies. When he is 11, his mother finally returns to Woolsthorpe, a widow again, bringing with her the 3 young children from her second marriage. The family is reconstituted under one roof, and perhaps there is some comfort in that. But 9 years have passed. The shape of a childhood has already been pressed, like a seal into warm wax, into everything that Isaac Newton would become. He would carry this with him always, the acute hunger for reassurance that his work was valued, the fierce, almost violent response to criticism, the difficulty of trusting that what he loved would not one day simply disappear. These things in a man are rarely born in a moment. They are grown slowly in the long, quiet years when the people who should have stayed did not stay. The elm trees outside the window cast their long shadows across the Lincolnshire fields. The candle on the table burns low, and the boy in the upstairs room draws another circle on the wall, patient and precise, and goes on trying to understand the shape of things. The next chapter is important for his schoolwork. Chapter 3. The Schoolboy Who Built Windmills. The road from Woolsthorpe to Grantham runs about 7 miles through flat Lincolnshire farmland, past stone walls and bare hedgerows, past fields that in summer go gold with wheat, and in winter lie open and gray under a wide sky. It is not a long road, but for a 12-year-old boy leaving the only house he has ever known, it might as well lead to another country entirely. Around 1655, Isaac Newton makes that journey. He is sent to King's School in Grantham, one of the oldest grammar schools in England, where boys are taught Latin and ancient Greek and the rudiments of classical learning. He will board in town rather than travel back and forth each day, lodging in the home of a local apothecary named William Clark on the High Street. It is, in many ways, an ordinary arrangement for a boy of his station. What happens inside it is anything but ordinary. At first, Newton is an unremarkable student. He is quiet, watchful, somewhat removed from the life going on around him. The other boys play and argue and form their alliances, and Newton observes all of this from a slight distance, as he has observed most things in his life, with attention but without full participation. His early academic performance is, by most accounts, middling. He is present, he is capable, he is not yet exceptional. Then comes the fight. The precise details have blurred with time, as such stories do. What is known is this: a boy at the school, older, larger, established in the way that school bullies become established, picks a fight with Newton. Perhaps he has mistaken the quiet watchfulness for weakness. It would not be the first time someone made that error. Newton fights back and wins, and is not satisfied with winning alone. He sets about outranking the boy academically, climbing from the lower reaches of the school to the very top, driven by something that his contemporaries recognized as not quite ordinary ambition. It was more personal than that, more necessary. He becomes the top student at King's School, and something in him, having been roused, does not go back to sleep. But the classroom is only part of the story. The more revealing chapter of these years is written not on parchment, but in wood and string and small mechanical parts. Newton's true education at Grantham happens in William Clark's apothecary house, among the shelves of dried herbs and chemical preparations, in the yard and the attic, and whatever corner of the building he can claim for himself. He builds things endlessly, obsessively, with a precision that astonishes everyone who sees it. He constructs working models of windmills, and not merely decorative ones. He watches a real post mill being constructed near Grantham, studies its mechanism with the focused attention of an engineer, and then builds his own miniature version. His, reportedly, is powered by a live mouse on a treadmill inside the structure. Whether this detail is entirely accurate or has grown in the telling, it captures something true. Newton's creations were not imitations. They were investigations. He built things in order to understand them from the inside out. He makes sundials, several of them, positioned at different points around the Clark house, accurate enough that the family reportedly uses them to tell the time. He constructs small water wheels. He builds a miniature cart that he can sit in and propel himself along by turning a handle. An early and entirely characteristic attempt to solve the problem of getting from one place to another through the application of his own mechanical reasoning. He makes lanterns from paper and wood and ties them to the tails of kites on dark nights, reportedly causing some alarm among the local villagers who look up to find strange lights moving through the Lincolnshire sky. There is a girl, too, in these years, Miss Story, the stepdaughter of the apothecary Clark. Newton is fond of her. He carves her name into the wooden windowsill of his room. In later life, she will recall that he was a sober, silent boy, always thinking, who showed her his mechanical inventions and sometimes carved her small tokens. They do not stay in contact as adults. Newton, it seems, is already beginning the long withdrawal from close human attachment that will define so much of his later life. But for now, he is simply a schoolboy in a Lincolnshire market town, filling every quiet hour with making and thinking and watching. The kite lifts against the winter sky. The paper lantern glows. Below, in the dark fields, the villagers look up and wonder what on earth they are seeing. Chapter 4. The Reluctant Farmer. Autumn comes early to Lincolnshire. By October, the fields are stripped, and the hedgerows have gone the color of rust, and the sky sits low and heavy over the land, as if it too has decided to settle in for the long wait until spring. It is into this particular autumn that Isaac Newton returns to Woolsthorpe, not by his own choosing, but by his mother's. Hannah Smith is a practical woman. She has been widowed twice. She has a farm to manage, land to work, animals to tend. Her eldest son is 17 years old, and 17 is old enough. She writes to King's School in Grantham and withdraws him from his studies. And just like that, the boy who has spent the last 4 years building windmills and climbing to the top of his class is handed a set of farm tools and pointed toward the fields. It does not go well. The historical record on this period is sparse, but what survives is vivid enough to paint a clear picture. Newton hates farming, not with the passive indifference of a boy who would simply prefer to be doing something else, but with a deep, almost physical incompatibility. As if the work itself is a foreign language his body refuses to learn. He is sent to the market at Grantham with a servant to sell the farm's produce, and reportedly slips away at the earliest opportunity to visit his old books at William Clark's house, leaving the servant to manage the business alone. He is given fences to mend and cannot be found. He is supposed to be watching the sheep and is instead sitting under an elm tree with a book open in his lap, the sheep having wandered wherever they please. His mother sends him out to work alongside a trusted farmhand, an older man whose job it is, essentially, to keep young Isaac on task. It does not help. Newton and the farmhand reportedly do not get along, and Newton takes every available opportunity to remove himself from the situation entirely. There is a story, passed down through the accounts of those who knew him in later life, that he would frequently retreat to a hedgerow with whatever he was reading, entirely absorbed, entirely unreachable, while the farm's work went undone around him. He is not being difficult for the sake of it. This is something harder to articulate and more important to understand. The mind that had spent 4 years quietly reorganizing itself around questions of how things work, around the patient pleasure of building and measuring and understanding, that mind simply cannot be made to care about turnips. The farm is not a calling for Newton. It is a wall. Fortunately, 2 men see this clearly. The first is Henry Stokes, the master of King's School, who had watched Newton rise from an unremarkable student to the head of his class. Stokes is not a man who forgets a mind like that. He makes the journey to Woolsthorpe and speaks to Hannah directly, arguing with some force that her son belongs back in school. He reportedly offers to waive Newton's school fees entirely, and goes so far as to speak of the boy's abilities in terms that go beyond the ordinary language of a schoolmaster recommending a pupil. There is urgency in his appeal, something close to alarm at what is being lost. The second is the Reverend William Issac, Newton's maternal uncle, who studied at Cambridge and understands what a university education can mean for a boy of genuine ability. He adds his voice to Stokes's, pressing Hannah from the family side, while Stokes presses from the academic one. Hannah Newton is not an unreasonable woman. She is a practical one, and practicality in the end points the same direction as the schoolmaster and the uncle. The farm will manage. There are other hands for it. This particular boy is not suited to the land, and perhaps, the land is not suited to him. She agrees. Newton can return to school. There is a moment recorded in the accounts of this decision that is worth pausing on. Henry Stokes, when Newton returned to King's School in preparation for Cambridge, is said to have stood before his assembled students and praised Newton publicly, with tears in his eyes. Whatever one makes of such a detail, and it has the quality of a story improved slightly in the retelling, it points to something real. People who spent time close to Newton in these years recognized that they were in the presence of something that did not come along often, something that required careful handling and the right conditions and a great deal of patience. In June 1661, at the age of 18, Isaac Newton leaves Woolsthorpe for Cambridge. His uncle William Issac, who studied at Trinity College, has recommended him to the university. He travels the 50 miles south with, it is reasonable to assume, very little regret about leaving the fields behind. The sheep are still somewhere out in the Lincolnshire countryside, grazing on whatever they found, while he was sitting under the hedgerow with his book. The fences may still need mending. The farm will go on without him, as farms do. And Isaac Newton, who could not be made to care about any of it, turns his face toward Cambridge and does not look back. Chapter 5. Cambridge and the new philosophy Trinity College receives Isaac Newton in the summer of 1661 as a subsizar, one of the poorer class of students who earn their keep by waiting on wealthier fellows, running errands, clearing plates, performing small services in exchange for their education. It is not a humiliating arrangement by the standards of the time, but it is a reminder, quiet and persistent, of where Newton stands in the order of things. He does not seem to mind, or if he minds, he does not show it. He is too busy reading. Cambridge in 1661 still teaches largely from Aristotle, the ancient Greek philosopher whose explanations of motion, matter, and the heavens have organized European thought for nearly 2,000 years. Newton attends his lectures, fulfills his obligations, and presents to the world the face of an adequate, unremarkable student. His tutors do not, for the most part, notice anything exceptional. He passes through his early years at Trinity quietly, leaving little impression on the official record. But in his private notebooks, a completely different story is being written. Newton keeps a notebook he titles in Latin, Questions Quaedam Philosophicae, which translates roughly as certain philosophical questions. Into it, he pours everything he is teaching himself outside of lectures. The work of René Descartes, whose mathematical approach to the natural world opens something in Newton like a door onto a long corridor. The astronomy of Galileo Galilei, the planetary laws of Johannes Kepler, the new natural philosophy that is slowly, across Europe, replacing Aristotle with observation and mathematics and careful experiment. He is not being taught this material. He is finding it himself in the university bookshops and the college library, and absorbing it with the same focused intensity he once gave to building windmills in a Lincolnshire apothecary's yard. There's one figure at Cambridge who eventually sees what is happening. Isaac Barrow, the Lucasian professor of mathematics, is one of the finest mathematical minds in England, and he is paying attention. He notices the quiet student with the unremarkable grades and the extraordinary private notebooks. A relationship forms, cautious at first, then deepening into something closer to recognition. Barrow will matter enormously in what comes next. In August 1665, Newton receives his bachelor's degree. He has spent 4 years at Cambridge and left almost no trace in the formal record of the institution. No prizes, no distinctions, no reputation among his peers. What he has instead is a mind that has spent 4 years quietly and methodically rebuilding its understanding of the universe from the ground up, working alone at night in a small college room by candlelight, arriving at questions that no one around him is yet thinking to ask. The university is about to close, a plague is coming, and Isaac Newton is about to go home. Chapter 6. The Plague Years, A Mind Set Free. The plague arrives in London in the spring of 1665, moving through the city's crowded parishes with the quiet efficiency of something that has done this before. By summer, it has killed tens of thousands. The bells of the city churches ring without stopping. The roads out of London fill with people carrying whatever they can. And in Cambridge, the university looks at what is coming down the road toward it and makes the only sensible decision available. It closes its doors and sends its scholars home. Isaac Newton packs his books and his notebooks and makes the 50-mile journey north to Woolsthorpe. He is 22 years old. He has a bachelor's degree and a head full of questions that have no answers yet. He does not know how long he will be away. He will be away for nearly 2 years. Later in his life, Newton would look back on this period with something that in another man might have been called nostalgia, but in Newton reads more like quiet astonishment. The recognition that something extraordinary had happened in those months, something that even he could not entirely account for. In a memorandum written decades afterward, he reflected that during this time he was in the prime of his age for invention, and that mathematics, philosophy, and the study of colors and the nature of light all came to him in those years. It is one of the rare moments in the historical record where Newton sounds almost surprised by himself, and the surprise is warranted. What happens at Woolsthorpe between 1665 and 1667 is, by almost any measure, the most concentrated flowering of scientific genius in recorded history. It begins with mathematics. Newton has been wrestling, in his Cambridge notebooks, with the problem of curves, how to calculate the area beneath them, how to find the rate at which a changing quantity changes. These are ancient problems, worked on by Kepler and Descartes and others, but never fully solved. In the quiet of his Woolsthorpe study, Newton works out what he will call his method of fluxions, what the world will later know as calculus. He does not announce this. He does not write it up for publication. He simply works it out, notes it in his private papers, and moves on to the next question. The next question is light. He obtains a glass prism, a triangular piece of glass, the kind sold at fairs and markets as a curiosity, and carries it to his room. He closes the shutters against the daylight, leaving only a small round hole through which a single beam of sunlight enters. He holds the prism in the beam and watches what happens on the opposite wall. What happens is this: the white beam of sunlight does not pass through the glass unchanged. It spreads into a long band of color, red at one end, violet at the other, and every gradation between. The colors of the rainbow drawn out of what had appeared to be plain, colorless light. This is not in itself entirely new. Others have observed the same effect with prisms. What is new is what Newton does next. He takes a second prism and holds it in the path of one of the separated colors, a pure beam of red, for instance, and finds that the second prism bends it but does not break it further into new colors. The red stays red, which means something profound and unexpected. White light is not pure. It is not the absence of color or the combination of darkness and brightness, as Aristotle had suggested. White light is the combination of all colors simultaneously, each one present and distinct, waiting only for the right conditions to be revealed. He works through this slowly, methodically, checking and rechecking, the way he has always worked. The shuttered room, the small hole in the window, the beam on the wall. Again and again, through the long, quiet days at Woolsthorpe, while outside the elm trees come into leaf and the sheep graze in the orchard, and the world goes about its ordinary business. And then there is the orchard itself. The story of Newton and the apple is one of the most famous in the history of science, and like most famous stories, it has been simplified and dramatized until the original is hard to find beneath the retelling. The apple did not, in all likelihood, fall on his head. But there is reasonable historical evidence that something happened in the Woolsthorpe orchard during these months, some moment of observation or reflection that directed Newton's thinking toward the question of gravity in a new way. What seems to have struck him was not the falling itself, but the question behind it. The apple falls toward the center of the earth. The moon, however, does not fall, it circles. Why should the same force not apply to both? Why should the pull of the earth stop at some point in the sky? What if it did not stop? What if it extended outward, growing weaker with distance according to a precise mathematical law, all the way to the moon and beyond? He begins to calculate. The mathematics is not yet quite right. His figures for the size of the earth are slightly off, and the result does not perfectly match the moon's observed motion. He sets the calculation aside in the way that a careful mind sets aside what it cannot yet fully confirm. But the idea is there now, planted and growing quietly, waiting for the measurements to catch up with the vision. Nearly 2 years after leaving Cambridge, Newton returns to it in the spring of 1667. He carries with him the foundations of calculus, a new theory of light and color, and the first fragile outline of a law that will one day explain the motion of every object in the known universe. He is 24 years old, and he has told almost no one. Chapter 7. The Lucasian professor Cambridge in the autumn of 1667 is much as Newton left it. The same stone courtyards, the same smell of coal smoke and damp wool, the same bells marking the hours across the fens. But Newton himself is not the same. He returns to Trinity College as a fellow in October of that year, a quiet promotion that gives him rooms of his own, a modest income, and something more valuable than either time. uninterrupted, unencumbered time to think. He takes his Master of Arts degree in 1668 and settles into the rhythms of college life with the relief of a man who has found at last the conditions he requires. He keeps irregular hours. He eats sparingly, often forgetting meals entirely, his food going cold on the table while he follows a line of thought into whatever room it leads him to. His hair goes uncombed for days. His rooms become a landscape of papers and instruments and small glass prisms catching the light from the window. Those who lived near him in college later recall that they rarely saw him, and when they did, he seemed to be moving through a world slightly different from the one everyone else inhabited, present in body, elsewhere in mind. He does not seem lonely. Solitude, for Newton, is not deprivation. It is oxygen. In 1669, 2 years after his return, something significant happens. Isaac Barrow, the Lucasian professor of mathematics, the man who had quietly recognized Newton's abilities during his undergraduate years, decides to resign his chair. The Lucasian professorship is one of the most distinguished academic positions in England, endowed by Henry Lucas in 1663 specifically to advance the study of mathematics and natural philosophy at Cambridge. Barrow is leaving to take up a position as royal chaplain, and he has a very clear view of who should succeed him. He recommends Newton without hesitation. In the autumn of 1669, at the age of 26, Isaac Newton becomes the second Lucasian professor of mathematics at the University of Cambridge. It is an extraordinary appointment for a man so young, and Barrow's recommendation makes plain what he thinks of him, describing Newton as a fellow of extraordinary genius and proficiency, which in the careful language of academic endorsement amounts to something close to awe. The professorship requires Newton to deliver lectures at least once a week during term on any topic within the broad range of mathematics and natural philosophy. He chooses optics. For several years, the lectures he delivers in the small lecture room at Cambridge lay out in careful and systematic order everything he has discovered in the shuttered room at Woolsthorpe with his prism and his beam of light. The lectures are not well attended. This is a fact the historical record preserves with a certain gentle irony. Newton stands at the front of the room and explains, in precise and rigorous terms, discoveries that will eventually reshape the entire science of light, and the benches before him are largely empty. He is said to have sometimes lectured to no one at all, standing at the board in the quiet room and working through his proofs regardless, then depositing his written notes in the university library as the regulations required. He does not appear to have been troubled by this. Newton's relationship with an audience was, at best, complicated. What mattered to him was the work itself, the thinking, the proving, the knowing. Whether anyone was listening was, in some deep sense, secondary. What does reach an audience is something he builds with his hands. In 1668 and 1669, drawing on his understanding of optics, Newton constructs a new kind of telescope. The telescopes of the time use lenses to gather and focus light, but lenses have a persistent problem. They scatter white light into its component colors, producing blurred and rainbow-fringed images. Newton, who understands exactly why this happens, designs around the problem entirely. Instead of a lens, he uses a small curved mirror to gather the light and focus it. The result is a reflecting telescope, compact and remarkably powerful. His first model is only 6 inches long, but produces images comparable to a conventional telescope many times its size. In 1671, he sends the instrument to the Royal Society in London. The response is swift and warm. The Society is impressed. Newton is elected a Fellow in January 1672, and for a brief and uncharacteristic moment, he steps into the light, a young professor from Cambridge, with an invention in his hands and, for once, a room full of people willing to look. It will not stay simple. It never does, with Newton. But for now, in this particular winter, the telescope gleams, and the room is attentive, and everything that follows is still waiting just around the corner. Chapter 8. Light and its Secrets. The reflecting telescope arrives at the Royal Society in London in the winter of 1671, and it causes something close to a sensation. It is a small instrument, no more than 6 inches long, but it does what the long, unwieldy refracting telescopes of the day cannot do without the distortion of color that plagues them all. Newton has solved that problem not by improving the lens, but by eliminating it entirely, replacing it with a carefully ground concave mirror that gathers light and brings it to focus cleanly, without the rainbow fringing that makes the edges of celestial objects blur and bleed. The Fellows of the Royal Society pass it among themselves and look through it and agree that it is remarkable. King Charles II is shown it. Word spreads. For the first time, Isaac Newton has a reputation beyond Cambridge. The Royal Society, founded in 1660 under the patronage of King Charles, is the beating heart of natural philosophy in England, a gathering of curious, ambitious, sometimes rivalrous men who correspond across Europe, publish in the Philosophical Transactions, and argue with great energy about the nature of things. Newton is elected a Fellow in January 1672 at the age of 29. It is an honor, and he receives it as one. And then, emboldened perhaps by the telescope's warm reception, he does something he has never done before. He writes up his theory of light and color, the work he first developed in the shuttered room at Woolsthorpe 6 years earlier, and submits it to the Royal Society for publication. The paper appears in the Philosophical Transactions in February 1672. It is titled, plainly and directly, as a letter describing a new theory about light and colors. In it, Newton lays out what his prism experiments revealed, that white light is not simple, but composite, that it contains within it all the colors of the spectrum, each one bent by glass at a slightly different angle, each one irreducible and distinct. It is a careful paper, methodical and precise, grounded at every point in what he has actually observed, rather than what theory might predict. The response is not what he hopes for. Robert Hooke reads the paper first, as the Society's curator of experiments, and his reply is swift and dismissive. Hooke is a remarkable man in his own right, a brilliant experimenter, a tireless observer, a person of genuine scientific accomplishment. But he is also territorial in the way that people become when they have spent years establishing themselves in a field and then watch someone arrive and rearrange the furniture. He has his own theory of light based on waves and pulses, and he does not find Newton's particle-based account convincing. His critique is not without technical substance, but it is delivered with a confidence that tips into condescension. From Europe, other objections arrive. The Dutch mathematician Christian Huygens, whose opinion carries enormous weight across the continent, raises questions. Others write with their own alternative explanations, their own experimental results, their own reasons why Newton must be mistaken. Newton responds to each objection carefully, methodically, in long letters that demonstrate both the depth of his thinking and the thinness of his patience. He is not a man who handles criticism as an abstract exercise. For Newton, criticism of his work and criticism of himself are not easily separated. Each letter of objection lands somewhere deeper than the merely intellectual, in a place formed long ago in a cold stone house in Lincolnshire, where the things he loved had a habit of being taken away. The correspondence drags on through 1672 and into 1673. Newton grows increasingly exhausted by it. He writes to Henry Oldenburg, the secretary of the Royal Society, who has been managing the exchange of letters, expressing his desire to be free of the whole business. He is, he says, resolved to have nothing more to do with philosophy. He does not mean it entirely. He cannot mean it any more than a river can resolve not to run downhill. But the sentiment is real. The exposure of publication has cost him something he is not willing to keep paying. He retreats. Not dramatically, not with announcement, but simply and completely. Back into the privacy of his Cambridge rooms, his private notebooks, his experiments with light, and his calculations, and his alchemical furnace that burns through the night. The world of public natural philosophy continues without him, corresponding and debating and publishing, and Newton watches it from a distance with something between disdain and longing. He will not publish again in any significant way for more than a decade. What the world does not know, what it cannot know, because he has told almost no one, is that the man who has just withdrawn from its sight is already in possession of ideas that would, if released, overturn almost everything it currently believes about the physical universe. He keeps them to himself, as he has always kept his most important things, and the candle in his Cambridge window burns on through the quiet English nights, steady and solitary, and very far from going out. Chapter 9. The Long Silence and the Alchemist's Fire. There is a particular quality to the silence that follows a withdrawal. It is not the silence of emptiness. It is the silence of a room where someone is still very much present, still very much at work, but has drawn the curtains and turned the lock and decided, for reasons that feel necessary, not to be disturbed. For 12 years after his retreat from the correspondence over light, Isaac Newton lives inside exactly that kind of silence. From the outside, Cambridge sees a Lucasian professor who delivers his lectures to near-empty rooms, since few students can follow them, fulfills his college obligations, and otherwise keeps almost entirely to himself. He publishes nothing of significance. He attends few public gatherings. He corresponds selectively, briefly, with a small circle of people he has chosen to trust, which is to say, a very small circle indeed. But behind the closed door of his Trinity College rooms, Newton is burning. The furnace is the first thing to understand. From some time in the early 1670s, Newton maintains a small furnace in his laboratory, and it burns almost continuously, day and night, through winter and summer, through term and vacation. His assistant Humphrey Newton, who works with him during the 1680s and is no relation, will later recall that Newton sometimes worked so late into the night that he barely slept, and that the furnace was rarely cold. He would work through the early hours of the morning, sleep for a few hours, and return to the fire. What he is doing at that furnace is alchemy. This word requires some care. To modern ears, it sounds like superstition, the foolish ancestor of real chemistry, the pursuit of charlatans and dreamers. But in the 17th century, alchemy occupies a more complicated position. It is a body of ancient knowledge, obscure and encoded, concerned with the transformation of matter, with understanding what things are made of at their deepest level, and what can be made from them. Many of the most serious natural philosophers of Newton's age take it seriously, and Newton takes it more seriously than almost any of them. His alchemical notebooks run to hundreds of thousands of words. He reads every alchemical text he can find, in Latin, in English, in translation from older languages. He annotates them, cross-references them, extracts their principles into his own organized summaries. He conducts experiments, melting metals, combining substances, observing what happens when matter is subjected to heat and pressure and time. He is looking for something. Exactly what he believes he might find is difficult to say with certainty. His notes are deliberately encoded in the traditional alchemical manner, full of symbolic language and veiled reference. But the search is genuine, and it is pursued with the same methodical intensity he brings to everything else. His hair, examined after his death, is found to contain very high levels of mercury. It is the quiet residue of all those years beside the furnace, breathing the fumes of experiments whose materials were sometimes deeply toxic. He does not know this, of course. Nobody does yet. Alongside the alchemy, and equally hidden from the world, Newton is engaged in another private pursuit that would, if known, have endangered his position at Cambridge and potentially far more. He is rereading the foundational documents of Christianity with the same critical attention he gives to everything else. And he does not like what he finds. The doctrine of the Trinity, the central teaching that God exists as three persons in one being, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, strikes Newton, after years of careful textual study, as a later corruption of the original Christian faith. He becomes convinced, through his reading of early church history and the original Greek texts of Scripture, that the doctrine was introduced by human councils centuries after Christ and does not represent genuine divine revelation. He writes about this at great length, in manuscripts he never publishes, never shows to more than one or two trusted correspondents. This is not a safe position to hold in 17th century England. The Lucasian professorship requires its holder to take holy orders in the Church of England. Newton quietly arranges an exemption, a royal dispensation obtained through careful negotiation, that releases him from this requirement without requiring him to explain why. He is granted it in 1675. The reasons are never publicly stated. He corresponds during these years with the philosopher John Locke, one of the few people to whom he shows his theological writings. The two men exchange long letters about Scripture and church history, about the nature of religious authority, about what can and cannot be known with certainty. It is one of the warmer intellectual friendships of Newton's life. Cautious and careful, as Newton's friendships always are, but genuine. There is also, during these years, a brief and curious correspondence with Robert Hooke in 1679. Hooke writes to Newton seeking to renew contact, and Newton, against his own better instincts perhaps, engages. In the exchange, Hooke describes his conception of planetary motion as the result of a central attracting force combined with a body's natural tendency to move in a straight line. It is an idea that touches, obliquely, on things Newton has been thinking about since the Woolsthorpe years. Newton later insists that Hooke told him nothing he did not already know. The question of what each man owed to the other will never be fully resolved, and it will generate bitterness enough for 2 lifetimes. By the early 1680s, Newton is 50 years old. He has published almost nothing in a decade. The world of natural philosophy has largely continued without him, citing his optical work with varying degrees of acknowledgement, puzzling over his silence, occasionally wondering what has become of the man who sent that extraordinary reflecting telescope to the Royal Society and then seemed to disappear. What has become of him is this. He is sitting beside a furnace in Cambridge, reading ancient texts by firelight, thinking thoughts that are, by any measure, the most consequential of the age. The door is still closed, the curtain is still drawn, but not for much longer. Chapter 10. The visit that changed everything. The summer of 1684 is warm and quiet in Cambridge. The university in August is largely emptied of its term-time population. The students gone home, the college courts still and sun-warmed, the narrow streets moving at the slower pace of a town temporarily returned to itself. It is into this quieted place that Edmund Halley arrives one afternoon, riding up from London with a question in his pocket that he has not been able to answer himself. Halley is 27 years old, already well established in the world of natural philosophy, an astronomer of real ability, a fellow of the Royal Society, a man of easy charm and genuine intellectual curiosity who moves through the difficult personalities of the scientific world with a diplomatic grace that Newton, conspicuously, does not possess. He has come to Cambridge because earlier that year in London, a conversation between three men arrived at an impasse, and Halley has decided that the only way past it is to ask Newton directly. The conversation had taken place in January, over coffee or something stronger, between Halley, the architect Christopher Wren, and Robert Hooke. The three men had been discussing the motion of the planets, specifically whether the force that holds them in their orbits around the sun might follow what mathematicians call an inverse square law, meaning that the force weakens in proportion to the square of the distance from the sun. Double the distance, and the force becomes 4 times weaker. Triple it, and 9 times weaker. It is an elegant mathematical relationship, and there are reasons from Kepler's laws of planetary motion to suspect it might be correct. But suspecting and proving are not the same thing. Wren offers a prize, a book worth 40 shillings, to whichever of them can produce a demonstration within 2 months. Hooke claims, with his characteristic confidence, that he has already worked it out, but that he is withholding his proof for strategic reasons, so that others might first appreciate the difficulty of the problem. The 2 months pass. No proof appears. Halley, characteristically, decides to go and ask someone who might actually know. He finds Newton in his rooms at Trinity College and puts the question to him directly. If the force attracting the planets to the sun follows an inverse square law, what shape would the resulting orbit be? Newton's answer is immediate, an ellipse. Halley is struck not only by the answer itself, which is what he had hoped to hear, but by the calm certainty with which it is delivered. He asks Newton how he knows this. Newton replies that he has calculated it. Halley asks to see the calculation. Newton searches through his papers and cannot find it. The papers in his rooms are voluminous, layered, organized, according to a system that is perhaps clearer to their owner than to anyone else. He cannot locate the specific document, but he tells Halley not to worry. He will redo the calculation and send it to him. Halley rides back to London. 3 months pass. Then, in November 1684, a manuscript arrives. It is 9 pages long, written in Latin, and Newton has titled it De Motu Corporum in Gearum, on the motion of bodies in an orbit. Halley reads it, and whatever he expected, it is not this. The 9 pages do not merely answer the question about ellipses. They go much further, deriving Kepler's 3 laws of planetary motion from first principles, demonstrating the mathematical relationship between orbital shape and the inverse square force, laying groundwork that Halley recognizes immediately as something far beyond what anyone in natural philosophy is currently working with. He writes back to Newton with barely concealed excitement, asking permission to register the work with the Royal Society. But something has been set in motion in Newton that will not stop at 9 pages. He begins to expand the manuscript almost immediately. The expansion takes on a life of its own, pulling in questions he has been sitting with for years: the nature of force and motion, the behavior of bodies moving through resisting mediums, the tides and their relationship to the moon, the paths of comets through the solar system. The 9 pages become 20, then 50, then something far larger and more ambitious than any single answer to a single question. Newton works with an intensity that, even by his own extraordinary standards, is remarkable. His amanuensis, Humphrey Newton, the assistant who has been watching him work for years, will later recall that during this period Newton ate little, slept less, and sometimes stood for long periods at his desk without writing anything at all, simply thinking before returning to the page with the expression of a man who has found what he was looking for. What drives this intensity is not entirely clear. Part of it, perhaps, is the relief of returning to ideas he has been carrying privately for nearly 20 years, and finally finding the mathematical tools fully equal to the weight of them. Part of it may be Halley's visit itself, the experience of being asked directly by someone who genuinely wanted to know, acting as a kind of release on everything that had been held back through the long silent years. And part of it, one suspects, is something older and harder to name: the boy who was left behind in a cold stone house, the student who sat in empty lecture halls and taught himself everything that mattered in private, the natural philosopher who retreated from the world after his first paper brought him nothing but argument. He has been waiting, in one way or another, for most of his life to show what he actually knows. Now finally the conditions are right. The question has been asked, the door is open, and Isaac Newton, alone in his Cambridge rooms as the autumn deepens around him, begins to write the book that will remake the world. Chapter 11. Writing the universe, 2.5 years. That is how long it takes. In the long perspective of history, it seems almost impossibly brief, the time required to set down, in careful Latin prose and mathematical demonstration, a complete account of how the physical universe operates. 3 books, hundreds of propositions, the motion of bodies on earth and in the heavens, unified under a single set of laws. Newton works through it the way he has always worked through everything, alone, at his desk, in the early hours of the morning when the college is quiet and the only sound is the scratch of his pen and the low burn of the furnace in the corner. Humphrey Newton, his amanuensis, watches all of this from close quarters and records what he sees. Newton eats little during these years. He sleeps in fragments. He sometimes forgets to eat at all, walking to the dining hall and then turning back halfway, pulled by some unfinished thought back to his desk. He laughs rarely. He entertains almost no one. The work has closed around him like water closing over a stone, and he moves through it with the focused calm of a man who has finally found the problem large enough to deserve his full attention. The structure that emerges across those 2.5 years is the Philosophia Naturalis Principia Mathematica, the mathematical principles of natural philosophy. 3 books. The first lays out the laws of motion and their mathematical consequences for bodies moving through empty space. The second examines motion through resisting mediums. The third, the one Newton initially threatened to withhold entirely, applies everything to the actual solar system. The orbits of planets and moons, the paths of comets, the behavior of tides, the shape of the Earth itself. Through all of this, Edmund Halley is present in the way that a good friend is present, not intrusively, but reliably. He visits Cambridge to check on progress. He manages the correspondence with the Royal Society. He reads the manuscript as it arrives in sections, offering careful responses that thread the difficult needle between honest engagement and the diplomatic encouragement Newton requires to keep going. When Robert Hooke raises his familiar cry of plagiarism upon seeing the first book, claiming Newton has stolen from him the inverse square relationship, Halley absorbs Newton's furious response, talks him quietly back from the edge, and persuades him not to suppress the remaining books in retaliation. It is a remarkable piece of friendship, largely unsung. Halley does one thing more. The Royal Society, its treasury depleted by the failed publication of a lavishly illustrated natural history of fishes, cannot afford to publish the Principia. Halley pays for it himself, out of his own pocket, at considerable personal cost, at a time when the Society cannot even meet his promised annual salary. Newton writes to him in the summer of 1687, after the final sheets have come back from the printer, the book is finished. Outside the window of his Cambridge rooms, the summer evening is long and still. The court below is empty. The elm trees stand without moving. Inside, a man sets down his pen, and the universe holds its breath. Chapter 12. The Book That Remade the World. The Principia appears in July 1687, and the world, or at least that small intense corner of it occupied by natural philosophers, stops and pays attention. It is a substantial volume, printed in Latin on good paper, its title page bearing the imprimatur of Samuel Pepys as president of the Royal Society, its 3 books bound together into something that feels, even in the hand, like an object of consequence. Edmund Halley, who has shepherded it from 9 scattered pages to this finished thing, writes a prefatory poem in Latin praising Newton's achievement in terms that would seem excessive if the content did not warrant them. He presents a copy to King James II, writing to the king that if ever a book deserved royal favor, this one does. A work in which so many great discoveries about the constitution of the visible world are laid out and placed beyond dispute. Beyond dispute. It is a confident claim. It will not go entirely unchallenged. What the Principia contains at its core is this: 3 laws of motion and 1 law of universal gravitation, from which almost everything else follows. The first law states that a body at rest remains at rest, and a body in motion continues in motion unless acted upon by an external force. The second connects force, mass, and the change of motion in a precise mathematical relationship. The third, perhaps the most quietly astonishing of the 3, states that for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. And the law of gravitation states that every object in the universe attracts every other object, with a force that depends on their masses and falls off with the square of the distance between them. From these 4 statements, Newton derives the orbits of the planets, the behavior of comets, the pattern of the tides, the slight flattening of the Earth at its poles, the precession of the equinoxes, that slow wobble in the Earth's orientation that had puzzled astronomers for centuries. Each one falls out of the mathematics like a consequence of something obvious, once you know where to look. Across Europe, the response among serious natural philosophers is a mixture of admiration and resistance. The admiration is for the sheer mathematical power of the work, its rigor, its scope, the way it moves from simple principles to vast conclusions without a single step that cannot be examined and verified. Even those who disagree with Newton's conclusions acknowledge that they are dealing with something of an entirely different order from anything that has come before. The resistance is focused largely on the concept of gravity itself. Continental philosophers, trained in the mechanical tradition of Descartes, find it deeply uncomfortable that Newton's gravity acts across empty space without any visible mechanism, without cogs or vortices or physical contact of any kind. How can the sun pull the Earth across 90 million miles of nothing? Newton's answer, given in the second edition of the Principia years later, is one of the most honest statements in the history of science. He has not, he writes, been able to discover the cause of gravity from phenomena, and he does not feign hypotheses. What cannot be deduced from the phenomena must be called a hypothesis, and hypotheses have no place in his philosophy. He describes what gravity does with perfect precision. What it is at its deepest level, he declines to say. It is a statement of remarkable intellectual humility, from a man not generally noted for humility of any kind. That other side of Newton's character asserts itself in the matter of Robert Hooke. When the first book of the Principia arrives at the Royal Society in 1686, Hooke immediately accuses Newton of having taken from him the essential idea of the inverse square law, the seed from which the whole great tree has grown. The charge, as most historians have assessed it, cannot be sustained in any meaningful sense. Hooke had intuited a relationship. Newton had proved it, refined it, extended it to cover the entire universe, and demonstrated its accuracy with mathematical rigor that Hooke's work entirely lacks. But Newton's response reveals something about the man that the mathematics cannot. Rather than offering a gracious acknowledgement, a gesture that would have cost him nothing and given Hooke, who is by this time ill and in decline, something to hold on to, Newton goes through his manuscript and removes nearly every reference to Hooke that it contains. The erasure is cold and complete. Both things are true simultaneously, as they often are with Newton. The science is magnificent. The behavior is not. The book goes out into the world carrying both of these truths inside it, the vast, luminous achievement and the human smallness that lived alongside it, as all great works do in the end, as all lives do. The world now has the Principia. It will never entirely be the same world again. Chapter 13. The Breakdown and the Bitter Dispute. There is a letter written in September 1693 that historians have puzzled over ever since it was first examined. It is addressed to Samuel Pepys, the diarist, the naval administrator, the man whose signature appeared on the title page of the Principia as President of the Royal Society. Newton writes to him in a tone so unlike his usual careful, controlled prose that it reads almost as if written by a different person entirely. He tells Pepys that he is in a state of great disorder, that he has neither eaten nor slept well for some time, that he must withdraw from Pepys's acquaintance and from that of the rest of his friends. A few days later, he writes to the philosopher John Locke in similar terms, accusing Locke, with no apparent basis, of having attempted to embroil him with women and of other offenses that Locke, reading the letter in quiet bewilderment, cannot begin to account for. Newton later writes again to Locke, apologizing, saying that he had been in a distemper that much affected his head and made him write incoherently. Something has happened to Isaac Newton in the autumn and winter of 1692 and 1693, something that goes beyond ordinary fatigue or overwork, beyond the ordinary strain of a mind that has always pushed itself past comfortable limits. What caused it is a question that historians and scientists have been turning over ever since. The theories are several and not mutually exclusive. Newton has been working for years in close proximity to the fumes of his alchemical furnace. Mercury, lead, antimony, and other metals heated and combined in a small enclosed laboratory. His hair, as later analysis will confirm, contains extraordinarily high levels of mercury. Mercury poisoning, in sufficient concentrations, produces precisely the constellation of symptoms Newton displays in these months: disturbed sleep, loss of appetite, paranoia, confusion, the sudden irrational suspicion of trusted friends. There is also the possibility of something more purely psychological: the accumulated exhaustion of a man who has spent the better part of 30 years in almost unrelenting intellectual effort, who has few close relationships to sustain him, and who has just completed the most demanding work of his life. The Principia is finished. The great question that organized his existence for 2 decades has been answered. What is left? It is not uncommon in the lives of people who have organized themselves entirely around a single consuming purpose, for the completion of that purpose to leave something close to emptiness behind. There is one more possibility, quieter and harder to document. A fire in Newton's rooms, reportedly sometime in the early 1690s, his dog Diamond said by some accounts to have knocked over a candle, destroys a quantity of his papers. Newton, coming into the room and finding the damage, is said to have stood looking at the ash and said simply, "O Diamond, Diamond, thou little knowest the mischief thou hast done." The story may be apocryphal in its details. The dog named Diamond appears in some accounts and not others. But Newton does refer in letters to having lost work during this period, and the loss of years of unrepeatable experiment and calculation to an accidental fire would be enough to disturb a far more emotionally robust person than Newton. By 1694, he is recovering. The letters become coherent again. The paranoid accusations fade. He resumes correspondence with Locke and other friends on something approaching normal terms, and the friendships, to their credit and his, survive the damage. But Newton is not entirely the same. The crisis has left a watermark. His attention begins to drift during these years, away from the pure mathematical philosophy that produced the Principia and toward other things, the administration of his Cambridge duties, his growing interest in public life, and, increasingly, a dispute that will consume more of his energy than almost any scientific problem he has ever faced. The dispute is with Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. Leibniz is a German mathematician and philosopher of formidable ability, one of the genuinely great minds of the age, a man who has made significant contributions across an extraordinary range of fields. He has also, working independently during the 1670s, developed his own version of calculus, a method of dealing with infinitesimal quantities and the mathematics of continuous change. He begins publishing it in 1684, 3 years before the Principia appears. Newton, privately, is furious. He developed his own method of fluxions, his private name for what will become calculus, during the plague years at Woolsthorpe, nearly 2 decades before Leibniz publishes anything. He has never published it in full because he has never published anything he did not have to, but it exists in his notebooks going back to 1665 and 1666, and he knows exactly when he had it. The question of who invented calculus first is, from a purely historical standpoint, not especially difficult to resolve. Newton got there earlier, Leibniz published first, and most serious historians of mathematics conclude that both men arrived at essentially equivalent ideas independently, through different routes and with different notation. Leibniz's notation, as it happens, is considerably more elegant, and is the version that mathematics will ultimately adopt. But Newton does not experience this as a historical question. He experiences it as a theft or something indistinguishable from one, and he responds to it in the way he has always responded to perceived attacks on his work. Not openly, not directly, but with cold and patient thoroughness. Through the late 1690s and into the early years of the new century, Newton begins orchestrating a campaign against Leibniz from behind the scenes, collecting testimony, marshalling correspondence, building a case for his own priority that he will eventually arrange to have presented to the world through intermediaries and institutional channels. In 1712, the Royal Society, under Newton's presidency, appoints a committee to investigate the question of who invented calculus. The committee's report, published in 1713, finds firmly in Newton's favor. It is only discovered later that Newton himself wrote substantial portions of the report. Leibniz, who has spent years trying to resolve the dispute through correspondence and direct appeal, never quite recovers from the institutional verdict. He dies in 1716, largely isolated, his contributions to calculus dismissed in England, his reputation darkened by an accusation that most of the scientific world outside of England does not believe. Newton outlives him by 11 years and is never, in any document that survives, recorded as expressing regret. It is one of the least comfortable episodes in a life that contains several. And yet, it is also, in its way, continuous with everything else Newton has been from the beginning. The boy who climbed to the top of his class to punish a bully, the young philosopher who erased Hooke's name from his manuscript, the man who withdrew from correspondence rather than endure the exposure of criticism. The pattern is consistent. The wound that produces it runs deep and was cut early and never quite healed. Outside his window, in the Cambridge courts, where he has lived for more than 30 years, the seasons turn as they always have. The elm trees go gold in autumn and bare in winter and green again in spring. The world continues. The dispute continues. And Newton, at his desk in the gathering dusk, works on, older now, somewhat diminished by what he has been through, but still present, still thinking, still carrying within him the questions that have accompanied him since he first looked up from the flat Lincolnshire fields and began to wonder what lay beyond the edge of everything he could see. Chapter 14. A New Life in London. The Mint and the Man. In the spring of 1696, Isaac Newton packs up his rooms at Trinity College, Cambridge, and prepares to leave. He has lived and worked within those stone walls for 35 years, longer than most people live in any single place across an entire lifetime. He arrived as an 18-year-old sub-Caesar, carrying his books and very little else. He leaves as the most celebrated natural philosopher in England, possibly in the world, and he leaves, if the historical record is any guide, without apparent sentimentality. The occasion for his departure is a letter from Charles Montague, his former colleague at Trinity and now Chancellor of the Exchequer, informing Newton that the king has approved his appointment as Warden of the Royal Mint. The Mint is housed in the Tower of London, that ancient, complicated structure on the north bank of the Thames, which has been at various points in its history a palace, a prison, an armory, and now, among other things, the place where England makes its money. Newton is to oversee its operations, investigate irregularities, and help manage what is, at the moment of his arrival, a considerable crisis. The crisis is the coinage. England's silver coins have been in circulation for generations, and generations of use have worn them down and, more damagingly, clipped them. Clipping is the practice of shaving small amounts of silver from the edges of coins and keeping them metal, while passing the diminished coins at full face value. It is, in effect, a slow and distributed form of theft from the currency itself, and by the 1690s it has become so widespread that the coins circulating through the English economy are on average worth significantly less than their face value. The resulting instability, merchants refusing coins, prices fluctuating, public confidence in the currency eroding, is a genuine threat to England's economic functioning. The solution, agreed upon before Newton's arrival, is a great recoinage. Every old silver coin to be called in, melted down, and reminted to a new standard, with milled edges that make clipping immediately visible. It is an enormous logistical undertaking, requiring the establishment of auxiliary mints across the country, the management of vast quantities of metal, and an administrative apparatus capable of handling the whole operation without allowing the economy to seize up in the meantime. Newton arrives at the Tower in April 1696 and applies himself to this problem with the same total commitment he has brought to every other problem in his life. Those who expected the warden's position to be taken lightly, it has, in the past, been treated as something close to a sinecure, a comfortable reward for a distinguished career, find themselves dealing with something quite different. Newton is at the Mint early and stays late. He keeps meticulous records. He visits the operational floors, understands the machinery, traces the flow of metal from raw material to finished coin, with the methodical thoroughness of a man who needs to understand how things work from the inside before he can improve them. He also hunts counterfeiters. This is the part of Newton's tenure at the Mint that surprises people most when they encounter it. The man who calculated the motion of the planets spends significant portions of his time in the 1690s moving through the taverns and prisons and underworld networks of London, gathering evidence against those who manufacture false coins. He conducts interrogations himself, sitting across from informers and criminals, in rooms far removed from any Cambridge lecture hall, extracting testimony, building legal cases, following threads of evidence through layers of deception and misdirection. He is good at it. The same qualities that made him an extraordinary scientist, the patience, the systematic accumulation of evidence, the refusal to accept an incomplete account, make him an effective investigator. He secures numerous prosecutions. His most significant target is a man named William Challoner, a skilled counterfeiter and confidence trickster who has been operating for years and who makes the particular mistake of not only continuing his activities after Newton begins pursuing him, but of attempting to discredit the Mint publicly in the process. Newton pursues Challoner with a thoroughness that goes beyond professional obligation and tips into something more personal. Challoner is convicted of high treason in 1699 and hanged at Tyburn. Newton's papers on the case survive, dense with carefully ordered evidence. In 1699, when the post of Master of the Mint falls vacant with the death of Thomas Neal, Newton is appointed to fill it. The Master's position is more lucrative than the Warden's. It carries a salary supplemented by a share of the profits of the minting operation, and Newton holds it for the remaining 28 years of his life. He retires formally from his Cambridge professorship in 1701. He is elected Member of Parliament for the University of Cambridge, briefly and without apparent enthusiasm, serving 2 short terms in 1689 and 1701 without making any recorded contribution to parliamentary debate. Cambridge, the Lucasian chair, the college rooms where he spent 35 years, all of it recedes into the past, and Newton does not seem to look back. London suits him in its way. The city is loud and various and full of the commerce and consequence that Cambridge, for all its intellectual intensity, could not offer. He keeps a house in Jermyn Street and later in Chelsea, and eventually in Kensington, and he furnishes it with a degree of comfort that his Cambridge rooms never had. He acquires crimson draperies. He owns silver plate. There are portraits of him from these years that show a man who has settled into a different kind of life, still serious, still watchful, but somehow less drawn in on himself than the solitary Cambridge scholar of the previous decades. His half-niece, Catherine Barton, comes to keep his house. She is young, witty, and socially accomplished in all the ways that Newton is not, and the house she runs becomes something approaching a social gathering place. Friends calling, conversation flowing, the world coming to Newton's door in a way it never quite did in Cambridge. He is 53 years old. He has weighed the coins of England and hunted its counterfeiters through the streets. And the quiet, solitary man from Woolsthorpe has become, almost without meaning to, a figure of the world. Chapter 15. President of the Royal Society. Power and Legacy. Robert Hooke dies on the 3rd of March, 1703. He dies as he has lived his later years, diminished, somewhat isolated, his considerable contributions to natural philosophy overshadowed in the public mind by the long shadow Newton's Principia has cast across everything that came before it. He is buried at St. Helen's Bishopsgate in London, and his grave is not marked in any way that survives. The portrait that is said to have hung in the Royal Society, the only portrait of Hooke known to have existed, disappears sometime around this period. There are those who have noted, without being able to prove, that its disappearance coincides rather neatly with Newton's assumption of power at the Society. Whether this is fact or legend remains unresolved, as so many things in the Newton-Hooke story remain unresolved. What is not unresolved is the timing. Newton, who has resisted deep engagement with the Royal Society for years, who has attended infrequently, contributed sporadically, and maintained a careful distance from an institution where Hooke held significant influence, accepts the presidency in November 1703, 8 months after Hooke's death. He will hold it until his own death in 1727, re-elected every year without opposition, presiding over the Society with an authority that his contemporaries variously describe as firm, autocratic, and absolute. The first thing he does as president is publish the Optics. The Optics has been finished, in its essential form, for years. Newton completed the bulk of it in the early 1690s, before his breakdown, and has kept it in his drawer ever since, unwilling, for reasons he never fully explains, to release it while Hooke is alive. Hooke's own work on light gives him standing to object, and Newton will not again submit his work on optics to the experience of 1672, when Hooke's dismissive response drove him into a decade of silence. But Hooke is gone now, and in 1704 the Optics appears. It is different from the Principia in ways that matter. It is written in English rather than Latin, which means it reaches a far wider audience. Its style is more accessible, less forbiddingly mathematical, more willing to describe what Newton saw and how he saw it before moving into the formal demonstrations. It contains not only his theory of light and color, but a series of remarkable observations about what he calls the fits of easy reflection and transmission, the phenomena we now understand as the interference of light waves, though Newton himself does not use that language and does not fully resolve what he is observing. At the end of the Optics, Newton appends a series of queries, numbered questions, growing more expansive and speculative as they go, in which he allows himself to think aloud about the nature of light, matter, force, and the structure of the universe in ways that the formal demonstrations of the Principia do not permit. These queries will prove enormously influential, not because they provide answers, but because they frame the questions that the next generation of natural philosophers will spend their lives pursuing. They are Newton in a different mode, less the architect of a completed system, more the old explorer pointing toward the territory that remains unmapped. He is knighted by Queen Anne in April 1705 at Trinity College, Cambridge, a ceremony that returns him briefly to the place where so much of his life was made, Sir Isaac Newton. The title is not awarded for the Principia or the optics specifically, but rather in the context of a political visit by the Queen to Cambridge, and there are historians who note a certain electoral dimension to the timing. But the honor is real, and the world receives it as confirmation of something it has already concluded, that this man occupies a position in English intellectual life that has no precedent and no equal. From his chair at the Royal Society, Newton runs the institution with the thoroughness he has brought to everything else. He reorganizes its finances. He oversees the move of its meetings from Gresham College to new premises at Crane Court off Fleet Street in 1710, a move that symbolically and practically separates the society from the institutional world in which Hooke had operated for so long. He manages its publications, its correspondence, its relations with foreign academies. He is not, by the accounts of those who work with him, an easy president. He can be cold, impatient, dismissive of those he considers insufficiently rigorous. But he is effective, and the society under his leadership becomes more stable, more authoritative, and more internationally respected than it has ever been. And then there is Leibniz. The calculus dispute, which has been smoldering for years, reaches its most damaging intensity in the decade between 1705 and 1716. Newton, from behind the scenes, coordinates a systematic campaign to establish his priority and discredit Leibniz's claims, gathering correspondence, arranging for supportive publications, and, most significantly, overseeing the Royal Society's investigation of 1712 that produces a report finding comprehensively in Newton's favor. The report is presented as the work of an impartial committee. It is, in significant part, the work of Newton himself. Leibniz writes letters, appeals to the evidence, asks for fair treatment. He finds little sympathy in England, where Newton's authority is essentially unchallengeable, and insufficient support on the continent to overturn the institutional verdict. He dies in November 1716 in Hanover, largely unattended, his employer, the new King George I, having already departed for London, taking his court and its recognition with him. Leibniz is buried without ceremony. His grave, like Hooke's, goes unmarked for years. Newton does not comment publicly on Leibniz's death, at least not in any document that survives. He continues his work, his presidency, his correspondence, as though nothing of particular note has occurred. There is a famous remark attributed to Newton in his later years about his great predecessor and adversary Leibniz, that taking mathematics from the beginning of the world to the time of Newton, what he did was the better half. Some historians question whether Newton actually said this, or said it in quite this form. Whether he did or not, it captures something true about how Newton understood the landscape of mathematics, as a territory he had largely discovered himself, in which others were guests. Outside the windows of Crane Court, London moves in its perpetual noise and motion. The Thames carries its traffic. The coffee houses fill and empty. The world that the Principia helped make rational, measurable, operating according to laws that can be found and written down, goes about its business. And at the head of the table, the old man in the presidential chair watches all of it with those large, searching eyes, and says very little and misses nothing. Chapter 16. The Old Philosopher. There is a painting of Newton made in 1712, when he is 69 years old, by the portraitist Sir Godfrey Kneller. It is one of several Kneller made of him across the decades, a record of the same face aging slowly through the long arc of an extraordinary life. In this one, Newton looks out from the canvas with an expression that is difficult to read with any certainty. The eyes are still sharp. The face has settled into its age without apology. There is something in the set of the mouth that might be authority, or weariness, or simply the expression of a man who has spent 70 years thinking very hard and has learned to keep most of it to himself. He is, by any external measure, at the height of his public standing. Master of the Mint, President of the Royal Society. Sir Isaac Newton, the most celebrated mind in England and arguably in Europe. His house in Kensington is comfortable and well appointed. The crimson draperies, the silver plate, the portraits on the walls. He receives visitors, corresponds with philosophers and mathematicians across the continent, attends the Society's weekly meetings with the regularity of a man for whom routine is both comfort and armor. And yet the inner life of these years is more complicated than the public portrait suggests, because Newton, in his 70s, is not only a scientist and an administrator, he is also, and perhaps primarily, a theologian, though a theologian of a kind that no church in England would recognize or welcome. His private religious writings, accumulated over decades and still carefully kept from the world, run to hundreds of thousands of words. He has read the scriptures in their original languages and cross-referenced them with the writings of the early church fathers and the records of the great church councils with the same systematic thoroughness he once brought to the Principia. His conclusions remain what they have been since his Cambridge years, that the doctrine of the Trinity is a human invention, introduced into Christianity by the Council of Nicaea in 325 and not supported by the original texts of Scripture. He corresponds cautiously with a small number of people on these matters, choosing his confidants with the care of a man who understands exactly what he is risking. He is also working in these years on a project of historical chronology, an attempt to reconstruct the true timeline of ancient history by cross-referencing biblical accounts with the astronomical records preserved in ancient texts. The work is called The Chronology of Ancient Kingdoms Amended, and it occupies him with increasing intensity through the 1710s and early 1720s. His method is characteristically Newton's. He identifies astronomical events described in ancient sources, calculates backward from the known positions of the stars to determine when those events must have occurred, and uses the results to anchor the chronology of ancient civilizations to fixed astronomical dates. A version of the chronology circulates privately in 1716. Reaching the French court through Princess Caroline of Wales, who shares it with the Abbé Conti, who shares it further than Newton intends. A French scholar publishes a response to it before Newton has published the work itself, and Newton is drawn into yet another priority dispute, smaller than the Leibniz affair, less bitter, but wearing in the way that all such disputes are wearing for a man of his age. The full chronology is not published until after his death. He is also still thinking about the Principia. The third edition, which will be the last he oversees himself, is prepared during these years with the assistance of Henry Pemberton, a young physician and mathematician who works closely with Newton from 1722 onward. Pemberton later writes that Newton's memory for the details of his own work remains remarkable even in his 80s, though his attention sometimes wanders in conversation. He is still capable, on his good days, of the focused precision that has characterized his thinking for 60 years. Catherine Barton, his half-niece, is the center of his domestic life through all of this, the person who keeps his house, manages his social world, and provides the closest thing to warm, daily companionship that Newton's life contains. She is a woman of considerable personal charm, and the house she runs attracts visitors of distinction. Jonathan Swift among them, who is fond of her, and various fellows of the Royal Society who come as much for Catherine's conversation as for Newton's. When she marries John Conduit in 1717, her husband moves into the household as well, and it is Conduit who will eventually manage Newton's affairs in his final years and serve as his principal biographer. Newton's physical health begins to decline more noticeably in the early 1720s. He suffers from gout, that painful inflammation of the joints that afflicts so many men of his era and station, and from what contemporary accounts describe as an inflammation of the lungs in 1722 that frightens those around him and from which he recovers more slowly than expected. He gives up riding in his carriage because the motion causes him discomfort. He moves carefully, but the mind is still there. Still running, still questioning, still following threads that have occupied it for decades. He corresponds with mathematicians. He attends the Royal Society when he can. He works on the chronology. He reads. There is a remark attributed to Newton near the end of his life, collected by William Stukeley, his friend and biographer, who recorded many of Newton's late conversations, in which he describes himself as a boy playing on the seashore, finding here and there a smoother pebble or a prettier shell than ordinary, while the great ocean of truth lay all undiscovered before him. It is the most famous thing he ever said about himself. And in the quiet of an evening in the Kensington house, with the fire burning low and Catherine's voice somewhere in the rooms below, it feels less like modesty than like something true. The honest assessment of a man who has seen further than almost anyone and knows exactly how far there still is to go. Chapter 17. The Last Days. The winter of 1725 settles over London with particular persistence. The Thames runs cold and gray between its banks. The city's rooftops disappear into low cloud for days at a time. And in the house at Kensington, where Isaac Newton has lived for the past several years, the fires are kept burning through the night. He is 82 years old, and the cold finds him in ways it did not when he was younger. His health has been declining, in small but accumulating increments for some time now. The gout that has troubled him for years has worsened. He suffers from what those around him describe as a weakness in his legs, a difficulty moving from room to room with the ease he once had. He has given up attending the Royal Society meetings in person, presiding instead from his chair at home when visitors come to him, receiving reports, signing correspondence, maintaining the formal continuity of his presidency from a distance. The society continues, the world continues. Newton, for the first time in his long life, is watching more of it from a distance than he would perhaps prefer. In January 1725, he presides for the last time over a meeting of the Royal Society. He is carried to the meeting in his chair, and those who see him there note that he is visibly diminished, thinner than he was, moving with the careful deliberateness of a man who has learned to husband his remaining strength. He conducts the meeting with his usual authority. He returns home afterward and does not preside in person again. He is still working. This is perhaps the most characteristic thing about him in the end, that the work continues even as everything else slows. He is preparing the third edition of the Principia with Henry Pemberton, reviewing the text with a care that Pemberton later recalls as remarkable for a man of his age, catching errors and suggesting refinements in the mathematical demonstrations with a precision that is not visibly dimmed. The third edition is published in 1726, the last edition of the Principia that Newton himself sees through to completion. He holds the finished book in his hands, this third version of the work that has defined his reputation and reshaped the world's understanding of itself, and whatever he feels in that moment, he does not record it. John Conduit, his niece Catherine's husband, who has become Newton's closest daily companion in these last years, keeps careful notes on Newton's condition and conversation during this period, and it is through Conduit's account that much of what we know about Newton's final months comes to us. Conduit is an attentive and affectionate observer, and his notes have the quality of someone who understands that he is watching the end of something irreplaceable and wants to get it right. In the late summer of 1726, Conduit records a conversation in which Newton describes, in his own words, the memory of the apple falling in the orchard at Woolsthorpe, a memory now more than 60 years old, from those extraordinary plague year months when a young man sat alone in a Lincolnshire garden and began to think about gravity in a way no one had thought about it before. He recounts it calmly, without drama, as simply one moment among many in a long life full of moments. Conduit listens carefully and writes it down. In the early months of 1727, Newton's condition deteriorates more rapidly. He is suffering from a bladder stone, a painful and debilitating condition that has troubled him for some time, and that the medicine of the age can do relatively little to alleviate. He has, by this point, a full and settled sense of how things are going. He puts his affairs in order with the methodical thoroughness that has characterized everything he has ever done. He has already divested much of his estate to relatives and friends in his later years, and he dies without leaving a formal will, a fact that creates some complications for those managing his affairs afterward, but that perhaps also reflects a man who has distributed what he wished to distribute while he was still present, to do it thoughtfully. On the 18th of March, 1727, Newton attends what will be his final meeting of the Royal Society, not in person, but through Conduit, who represents him. 2 days later, on the 20th of March, Isaac Newton dies in his sleep at his house in Kensington. He is 84 years old. The manner of his death, quiet, in sleep, in his own house, in his own bed, has a fittingness to it that the more dramatic deaths of history sometimes lack. A man who spent his life in the interior, thinking thoughts that no one else was thinking, working through the long solitary nights while the world slept around him, departing in the hours when the world is still. There is something right about that, though one is careful not to impose too much meaning on the simple biology of an old man's final night. His body is moved to the Jerusalem chamber at Westminster Abbey, where it lies in state for 8 days. The funeral, held on the 28th of March, is the first state funeral England has accorded to a figure recognized primarily for intellectual achievement. The Lord Chancellor carries one corner of the pall. 2 dukes and 3 earls carry the others. Most of the fellows of the Royal Society follow behind. Voltaire, who is in London at the time and will later write about Newton with enormous admiration, may be among the observers. He is buried in the nave of Westminster Abbey, near the entrance to the choir. The first scientist to be buried there. On the stone that marks his grave, those who come after will inscribe words in Latin that translate simply as, "Here lies Isaac Newton, knight, who by a strength of mind almost divine and mathematical principles peculiarly his own, explored the course and figures of the planets, The paths of comets, the tides of the sea, the dissimilarities in rays of light, and what no other scholar has previously imagined. The abbey is quiet around him. The city moves outside, and the universe he described continues on, exactly as he said it would. He came into the world too small to survive, fatherless, left behind by the one person who should have stayed. He spent his childhood alone in a cold stone house, drawing circles on the walls. He retreated from public life again and again, wounded by criticism, suspicious of closeness, more comfortable with the universe than with the people in it. And yet, from that solitary, difficult life came the laws that govern how every object in the cosmos moves. The mathematics that underlies modern physics, engineering, astronomy. The understanding that light itself is not simple, but endlessly various. A way of thinking about the natural world, precise, patient, mathematical, that we have never entirely put down. His hair carried mercury. His notebooks carried heresies. His heart carried wounds that never quite healed. He described himself near the end as a child gathering pebbles on the shore while the great ocean of truth lay undiscovered before him. It is the most honest thing he ever said. The ocean is still there. We are still, in our way, gathering pebbles, using tools he made, standing on ground he mapped. Sweet dreams, friends. And we'll meet again soon for another story.